The official history of World War II is a tapestry woven from famous names: Pearl Harbor, D-Day, Stalingrad. But what if I told you the war's most massive, most decisive confrontation is one most people barely understand? This battle, a clash of steel and will on the Russian steppes, was the true point of no return for Adolf Hitler. It was the moment the German blitzkrieg strategy, once unstoppable, was finally and permanently shattered. The scale of this confrontation, codenamed Operation Citadel, defies imagination. Over 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns were thrown into the fight. More than 2 million soldiers marched toward a single objective, the Kursk salient, 400 kilometers south of Moscow. In terms of sheer mechanized power deployed, it was arguably the greatest battle in the history of all warfare. And yet, this colossal event, this singular moment where the Red Army seized the strategic initiative forever, remains confined to specialist textbooks. This is the authentic story of the Battle of Kursk. Forget the simple narratives of Russian winter or Soviet numbers. We are going deep into the spy games, the strategic blunders, the desperate logistics, and the human cost of the fight that determined the outcome of the entire Eastern Front. Few are those who truly know the real story, and once you witness the sheer scope and complexity of this titanic struggle, you will understand why Kursk, not Stalingrad, was the furnace in which the German war machine was utterly destroyed. The war in the East had reached its terrible nadir for Germany. The humiliating, frozen surrender of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad in February 1943 had been more than just a military defeat. It was a psychological and political catastrophe. The aura of German invincibility, the very myth that had powered the blitzkrieg across Europe, was shattered. Every Axis soldier, from the trenches to the high command, understood the fundamental truth: the tide had turned. Adolf Hitler faced an impossible dilemma. To stand still meant waiting for the inevitable Soviet mass mobilization to overwhelm his lines. He was desperate for a grand, surgical counterblow that could restore momentum and force the Allies to recognize German strength. Operation Citadel, the offensive targeting the Kursk salient, was conceived as that Hail Mary pass, a strategic imperative to prove the Wehrmacht still had the capacity for overwhelming offensive victory. It was his ultimate desperate last dice roll to regain the initiative and change the course of history before the game was definitively lost. Failure at Kursk would mean the strategic initiative belonged to the Red Army forever. The stakes could not have been higher. The stage for this gargantuan clash was set by a distinct bulge in the Eastern Front, known simply as the Kursk salient. Picture the Soviet front line. It jutted 255 kilometers deep and 160 kilometers wide into the German-held territory, creating an exposed, ovular mass of Soviet forces. To the strategist's eye, this wasn't an obstacle. It was an opportunity, a gigantic military blister waiting to be lanced. The German strategy, the classic audacious pincer movement, was simple, brutal, and elegant. From the north, Field Marshal Model's Ninth Army would strike south toward the town of Kursk. Simultaneously, from the south, Field Marshal Manstein's Army Group South would strike north. The objective was a rapid meeting of the two armies at the center, searing the base of the bulge. This move would cut off and encircle the massive Soviet armies caught inside the salient, neutralizing a significant portion of the Red Army and potentially shattering their entire front. The logic was sound, the stakes were clear, and the plan promised nothing less than a decisive, war-altering victory. The one factor that could have guaranteed German success was the element of surprise and speed. Yet the entire offensive was hobbled by the indecision of one man. Despite the desperate need for immediate action, Hitler, obsessed with the supposed technical superiority of the new Tiger and Panther tanks, continually postponed the start of the attack. Originally slated for April, then delayed to May, then finally launched in July, Operation Citadel was postponed 3 times. This fatal error was the great, self-inflicted German blunder. Every day Hitler waited, the Soviet defense grew exponentially. These 3 months were a gift of crucial, unimpeded preparation time, which the Red Army exploited with brutal efficiency. By the time the German armored columns finally rolled, they were not striking a weak point. They were charging headlong into an unprecedented labyrinth of trenches, anti-tank guns, and minefields. Hitler's technological obsession had sacrificed the necessity of strategic mobility and reliability. These new machines were not the swift, decisive instruments of the blitzkrieg they were meant to be. They were heavy, complex, and vulnerable to the mud and breakdown. Behind the formidable steel of the new tanks lay the familiar, crushing reality of the Eastern Front. A young CS Corporal, Gunther Buschers, prepared for the assault. He wasn't thinking of victory or glory. He was thinking of home. In the days leading up to the offensive, the practice of writing a last will, our testament, became chillingly common across the German ranks. This wasn't a formal document. It was a desperate scribbled note to a mother or a sweetheart, just in case the odds, which every man felt in his gut, came true.
The High Command called it Operation Citadel, but to the men in the Panzers, it felt like a suicide mission. After Stalingrad, the Soviet soldier was no longer viewed as a predictable enemy, but as a relentless force, and every German knew the coming battle would dwarf anything that came before. That quiet, final act of writing a farewell to a loved one, knowing the chances of survival were slim, cuts through all the talk of superior armor. It reminds us that before the greatest tank battle in history, the true weapon being tested was the fragile, terrified will of the man inside the machine. The entire German strategy hinged on a catastrophic intelligence failure, the simple fact that Operation Citadel was no secret to the Soviet High Command, Stavka. While Hitler agonized over tank production, a shadowy network of spies and informants was systematically transmitting virtually all of the German attack plans, force concentrations, and exact timing straight to Moscow. Foremost among these was the Lucy Circle, a mysterious espionage operation often credited with delivering some of the most sensitive German plans. Figures like Rudolf Roessler, working from Switzerland, ensured the Russians had a complete, accurate, and real-time picture of the looming threat. The result was devastating. The Soviet commanders knew the exact axes of attack, the specific Panzer concentration points, and the intended objectives long before the first German tank engine roared. The Blitzkrieg was designed to exploit surprise and speed. Thanks to this massive intelligence hemorrhage, the German army was not launching an attack, they were rolling directly into a planned, perfectly executed ambush. This was the ultimate narrative twist that doomed the German offensive before it even began. With complete, accurate German plans in hand, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, faced a monumental strategic dilemma. General Georgy Zhukov, the strategic genius of the Red Army, initially argued for a preemptive strike, hitting the Germans before their new tanks were fully deployed. But Stalin made a colder, more calculated decision, overriding his generals with a masterstroke of strategic patience. The choice was to let the Germans throw themselves on our guns. This was a colossal gamble. Instead of fighting an open battle of maneuver, the Soviets would absorb the initial crushing blow within their prepared defenses. The idea was to intentionally bleed the German armored divisions dry, consuming their irreplaceable Tiger and Panther tanks against layers of trenches and mines. Only once the Wehrmacht was exhausted, slowed, and mechanically crippled would the Stavka unleash its fresh, most reliable strategic reserve, the best, most reliable tank armies, to deliver the decisive counterblow. This transformed Kursk from a chaotic battlefield into a deliberately, meticulously planned trap.
The delay Hitler granted the Soviets was exploited with a monumental, almost terrifying focus. Knowing the German attack was coming, the Red Army constructed what military historians call defense in depth on an unprecedented scale. This wasn't a single line of trenches. It was an elaborate, layered fortress stretching back 200 kilometers behind the front. This defensive system was comprised of 7 distinct lines, a labyrinth of fire trenches, artillery positions, and anti-tank strongpoints. To halt the German armor, the Soviets laid over 400,000 mines, creating fields of mines for miles that instantly negated the Panzer's vaunted speed. every single kilometer of the German advance was deliberately engineered to be an agonizing, bloody ordeal. Furthermore, this colossal effort involved over 300,000 civilians digging continuously to make sure that the vast tank formations would not strike the Soviet armies. They would strike a prepared, layered trap designed to bleed the mechanical heart of the Wehrmacht dry. This tactical mastery transformed the Kursk salient into the perfect, inescapable killing ground. The clock ticked past midnight on July 5, 1943. Across the front, German tank crews were making final checks, prepared to launch the largest armored assault in history at 4:30 a.m. But at 2:20 a.m., the vast, prepared silence of the steppes was brutally annihilated. The air became a deafening, continuous roar as the Soviets, warned by their intelligence network, unleashed a terrifying preemptive artillery barrage. This was no ordinary shelling. It was a deluge of firepower designed to inflict maximum psychological and material damage before the offensive could even begin. Thousands of shells combined with the screaming signature sound of the Soviet Katyusha rockets, Hitler's Stalin's organs, slammed into the tightly packed German staging areas. They struck supply dumps, communication centers, and most critically, the very Panzer concentration points the Germans had spent weeks assembling. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Instead of attacking a ready enemy, the German armies were caught completely by surprise, pinned down and disoriented. The strategic initiative was lost not an hour into the battle. The ground assault began under a cloud of confusion and terror, confirming the ultimate irony of Kursk. The Wehrmacht had been robbed of the only weapon that mattered, surprise, and was forced to begin its last great offensive already reeling from a massive blow.
The moment the German panzers rolled forward, they slammed not into a retreating enemy, but into the iron fist of the Soviet defense in depth. Despite unleashing nearly 2,000 tanks in the initial waves, a force unlike any seen before, the entire offensive ground to a halt almost immediately. The famed Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that had conquered Europe, was suffocated. Every meter was bought with blood and steel. Instead of a rapid breakthrough, German progress was measured in single-digit kilometers per day. A mere 6.5 kilometers in the north and 12 kilometers in the south on the first day. The vast minefields, anti-tank guns, and endless trenches turned the battle into a desperate, grinding slog. The superior long-range firepower of the Tiger tanks was neutralized as the battle devolved into close-quarters engagements, and the Panthers broke down in the mud. The German soldiers found themselves in a desperate carnage that they hadn't seen since the First World War. A horrifying, frustrating spectacle where their technological advantage was ruthlessly nullified by the sheer density of Soviet obstacles. The momentum was gone. The strategic clock was ticking against them. The German war machine had staked its last hope on superior engineering, but Kursk brutally exposed a fundamental misunderstanding of the Eastern Front's unique demands. The technical duel between the German Panther and Tiger and the Soviet T-34 was decided not by armor thickness, but by ground pressure and logistics. The colossal Tiger tank, while boasting thick armor and the phenomenal 88mm gun, was a victim of its own weight. Due to its comparatively narrow tracks, the pressure exerted on the soft, wet soil of the Russian steppes was immense. This gave it a poor power-to-weight ratio, making it sluggish and often miring it helplessly in the loose terrain. It was also a mechanical nightmare, with complex components constantly failing. In stark contrast, the ubiquitous Soviet T-34 was the genius of practical design. Though its armor was thinner, its wide tracks dramatically reduced its ground pressure, allowing it to traverse the mud and bog effortlessly. This superior agility meant the T-34 could rapidly maneuver into close range, where the Tiger's long-distance gun advantage was nullified. Furthermore, the T-34 was vastly easier to manufacture and maintain, possessing an operational range up to 600 kilometers, far superior to the gas-guzzling Tiger, around 100 kilometers. This disparity proved that, in the vastness of the Eastern Front, reliability and mobility were the true technological advantages, ruthlessly deconstructing Hitler's faith in sheer heavy armor. The Battle of Kursk was fought not just on the ground, but in the sky in a relentless struggle that resulted in air combat that was arguably the costliest in human lives of all history. The German Luftwaffe deployed massive forces, including the dreaded Stuka dive bombers, which delivered terrifying close-air support, striking ground targets with deadly precision using fragmentation bombs. However, just as on the ground, the German technological edge was ultimately defeated by Soviet volume and production capacity. The Red Air Force, with its vast reserves of aircraft and pilots, treated its air losses as completely acceptable, even expected. Where a German loss meant an almost irreplaceable gap in the Luftwaffe's limited eastern resources, the Soviets could lose 100 aircraft one day and launch 100 new ones the next. This created a meat grinder for German air superiority. The sheer number of sorties flown was staggering, with reports counting over 72 major air engagements in a single day. This continuous, brutal air war ensured that neither side could claim decisive aerial supremacy, keeping the fighting on the ground an agonizingly level, all-consuming, and utterly brutal affair.
For 5 agonizing days, the German pincers had bled, but they had not broken. Despite the Soviet defenses, Field Marshal Manstein's Southern Attack Group, led by the formidable SS Panzer Corps, had managed to grind through the prepared lines and achieve a dangerous breakthrough. Realizing the immediate threat to the key rail junction of Kursk, Soviet commanders Zhukov and Vasilevsky knew the moment of the strategic counterblow had arrived. They committed their final, decisive reserve, the 5th Guards Tank Army, led by General Pavel Rotmistrov. This fresh, formidable force, numbering over 800 tanks, was ordered to move directly into the path of the advancing SS Panzer divisions. This decision created the conditions for the most massive armored confrontation in history, centered on the small village of Prokhorovka. This was the ultimate narrative pivot point. The 2 greatest armored forces on Earth were now irrevocably committed to a head-on collision, throwing aside the traditional rules of warfare. This wasn't strategy, it was an act of tactical desperation, signaling that the campaign was about to reach its terrifying, bloody climax. The morning of July 12th dawned over Prokhorovka, setting the stage for the most terrible tank combat of all time. General Rotmistrov unleashed the 5th Guards Tank Army, a fresh, howling force of T-34s and other armor, directly at the advancing SS Panzer Corps. This was the moment of ultimate climax, a desperate, deliberate collision that ignored every principle of armored warfare.
The 2 vast armies of steel immediately devolved into utter chaos. As one German veteran recalled, "I had never seen such a mass of tanks rushing on top of each other." The battlefield was instantly obscured by smoke and dust, turning the fight into a massive, confused melee. This close-quarters fighting was the Soviets' masterstroke. The powerful, long-range guns of the German Tigers were effectively nullified. They couldn't aim or maneuver properly, and the agile T-34s could swarm them, striking their vulnerable sides and rear. The air filled with the screech of metal, the roar of engines, and the horrifying sight of turrets blown clean off their holes flying through the air. This was a duel to the death, a savage, intense, hour-by-hour struggle where crews fought not just with cannons, but with machine guns, grenades, and often by ramming each other in desperation. When the dust finally settled, the German thrust, though not completely destroyed, was strategically exhausted. The initiative that Hitler had gambled everything on was now irrevocably seized by the Red Army. Just as the SS Panzer Corps was locked in the desperate, bloody embrace at Prokhorovka, a hammer blow struck Hitler's headquarters from an unexpected direction. News arrived that the Allies had launched Operation Husky, landing massive forces on the island of Sicily. For Hitler, obsessed with defending the periphery of his empire, this new front was an immediate existential threat.
In a display of strategic myopia that historians still debate, Hitler ordered the unthinkable, the immediate withdrawal of the 3 most powerful SS Panzer divisions, the very core of the German offensive force at Kursk, to reinforce the collapsing Italian front. This decision was the ultimate historical irony. A distant secondary Allied operation had, by forcing Hitler's hand, directly determined the outcome of the most important battle on the Eastern Front. The removal of those elite divisions, even while the battle was raging, signaled the complete surrender of the strategic initiative. Operation Citadel was effectively over, not by a final Soviet assault, but by the pressure of the global war finally crushing Germany's capacity to choose its battles. The moment Hitler's panzer divisions turned their backs to head for Italy, the Soviet High Command executed the second phase of their master plan, the immediate, relentless counteroffensive known as Operation Kutuzov. The tide of the war didn't just turn, it roared back with overwhelming force. The German withdrawal was not an orderly retreat. It was a desperate race to avoid the complete annihilation that had befallen the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. As they fell back, the Germans executed a punishing scorched earth policy, destroying bridges, contaminating wells, and sowing dense fields of mines to slow the Soviet pursuit. Despite these measures, the relentless Red Army pursuit pushed the German armies, particularly Model's forces in the north, back toward the defensive anchor of the Hagen Line. The Soviets had secured more than just a local victory. They had won the strategic initiative permanently. From this point forward, the Eastern Front would become a one-sided war of maneuver, with the Red Army dictating the terms of engagement until the final collapse of the Third Reich. The end of the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 was the definitive death certificate for the German offensive capability on the Eastern Front. The promise we made to deliver the authentic story lies in synthesizing the strategic flaws that transformed Hitler's ultimate gamble into an irreversible defeat.
The reasons for the German failure are not singular. They form a catastrophic chain reaction. First and foremost was Hitler's strategic indecision and delay, which sacrificed the element of surprise and granted the Soviets 3 months to construct the legendary defense in depth. Second was the catastrophic intelligence failure that rendered every major panzer concentration point a known target. Third was the masterful Soviet patience and use of strategic reserves, culminating in the brutal close-quarters fighting at Prokhorovka, which neutralized the German technological advantage. Koursk proved that in a war of attrition, reliability and volume trumped pure technological spectacle. The immense tank losses suffered by the Wehrmacht, particularly the irreplaceable Tigers and Panthers, gutted their armored corps, while Soviet production ensured their forces remained robust. But the most profound change was psychological. The Soviet soldier who emerged from the trenches was no longer the disorganized man of 1941. He was a resilient, unflinching professional, indifferent to bombs and shells, who had seen the German war machine defeated, not by winter, but by pure strategic competence. The Red Army had permanently seized the strategic initiative, and the road to Berlin, though long and bloody, was now irreversible. This was the true final legacy of Kursk, the end of the German threat and the genesis of the ultimate Allied victory.